Hello everyone and welcome to our Business Web Practices series here at Clark College. This is the fourth week of the series, and today I'm proud to have at Clark College Cheryl Bledsoe. Take it away.
Take it away. All right. Well, it's an honor and a privilege to be here and speaking to Bruce's class, so I think we're going to have a lot of fun today. I will tell you, because I did a little bit of research ahead of time and watched a few of your previous speakers, is that I'm probably going to be the least tech speaker that you have in your whole series of speakers that are coming to speak here at Clark College. Nevertheless, I will tell a lot of stories. A lot of these are my personal stories. A lot of them are my own experiences in social media, and a lot of my own experience as a government employee in social media, which creates a whole slew of fun stories. So today we're going to go over kind of my story. How did a non-tech person get into the whole tech world of social media? I'm going to tell you that I did not have an account in MySpace, which is going to be, we'll play into something later, but certainly piqued my interest. Why social media should matter. We're going to talk a lot of different examples of why social media has been important, both for what I do on a day-to-day basis, as well as why it should be important for you as a student or as any type of business leader here in the United States. We're going to go through a lot of different social media illustrations. In fact, these PowerPoint slides are mostly just pictures, just kind of little memory peeks so that I can tell you a whole bunch of fun stories. I'm going to talk about why you should care and really have some good class discussion. I want you to know that you can interrupt me at any point in time. I'm not going to use words like jQuery and JavaScript. In fact, honestly, I was learning a little bit in the back of your class when I came early because I am not an official coder. I am not a technologist by any stretch of the imagination, as you're soon going to find out. So what is my story? My story started in college. I was a trained sociologist. I got my undergraduate degree in sociology with an emphasis in crime and deviance, as well as a double major in political science with a focus in government affairs. Now, none of that had anything to do with technology, and I'll tell you, I took a word processor to my college and university, and I thought that was pretty high tech. Paid about $475 for it, typed all of my papers out, and still used whiteout to figure out how to edit some of those papers and turn them into my college professor. But what I was trained in was looking at cultural and behavior trends, and how do people communicate, how do they talk to each other, and what does that communication have for our future? In terms of, are we the same people today that we were yesterday, or are we a different people based on the way that we interact with each other and the way that we interact with different types of technology, types of tools? I am actually more of a classic millennial when it comes to my career field because I've had three major careers. In my 20s, I walked out of college and got a degree in a juvenile correction facility. I worked for 2 years in an assault and robbery unit with young boys who had been arrested for a variety of different crimes. I then spent the next 8 years as a juvenile probation officer, working with kids, at-risk kids, dealing with creating case plans and figuring out what to do right at the point of their arrest. So I began to deal with kids that would get arrested. They would come to our facility. We would have 5 hours by law to figure out how to put them into care, treatment, release them home to their parents, or do whatever we had to do to put them into a safe environment and get them sort of on their way through the juvenile justice system. In my 30s, literally the weekend that I turned 30, I ended up becoming an emergency manager down in Clackamas County. Now, this was really interesting because I hadn't grown up and wanted to be a disaster manager. Using natural disasters, technology disasters, I ended up, after 9/11, volunteering for a lot of different sort of help organizations. I worked as a trauma intervention volunteer where I would respond to death situations within 15 minutes of that death being reported to 911. There's a whole group of kind of community angels that go do that show up to be with families until their support network arrives. So literally we'd respond to a variety of different situations, dead body on the floor, and we would help the family members until their support network arrived and helped out. I also volunteered for the Red Cross and their disaster action team. I worked on responding to house fires and a lot of different sort of house burning. We went into the situation to help families recover from a fire disaster. That means getting immediate shelter, immediate clothing, and a lot of different sort of vouchers and stuff to get folks through for the next 24 to 72 hours after a fire situation. And all of that resulted in, what am I going to do career-wise? And so at Clackamas County, where I was working as a juvenile probation officer, I decided I'd just gotten my master's degree and thought, I want to do something more general government. So I applied for a position as a commissioner assistant, but I didn't get it. I was determined to be overqualified, too much experience on my hands, and was told, we have a different position that we have in mind for you. 9/11 had happened 2 years prior, but we have a whole bunch of different grant programs and a lot of things that we're trying to sort out. And so would you be willing to look at creating the first Homeland Security program in Clackamas County? And so that was my job and took me into the world of emergency management. Now, what's notable about that career in emergency management was I suddenly was thrust into a world of handling natural disasters, technology disasters, man-made terrorism type situations, and a lot of different scenarios that you wouldn't even dream happen behind the scenes of your everyday environment here. I was in Oregon City at the time. Within 2 years, I moved up here to Clark County, and I was the emergency manager here at Clark County for 8 years and handled a lot of different situations, including presidentially declared windstorms, a variety of landslides and different flooding type situations, as well as situations that never made it into the newspapers or the everyday view that folks had to deal with. But one of those windstorms was unique. I had a windstorm that occurred on a Thursday night, and I had within an hour and a half, as all good windstorms do, they happen about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, about an hour or so before everyone goes home for the day, right? And in that windstorm, we had winds up to 120 miles an hour. We had 2 to 3 different landslides and over $2 million in damage, which made it a presidentially declared windstorm. Now, what was unique for me was that my IT department only worked 4 days a week, and I was unable to put any information onto the internet from that Thursday night that the windstorm happened until my IT department got in on Monday. That was the same weekend that my local newspaper decided that they were going to write 4 or 5 different articles about whether or not first responders were doing anything for that windstorm. So we essentially took a bit of a bath in the media, saying, were we lazy? Were cops out eating donuts? Were we actually doing anything with regards to this presidential disaster? Because our website said, welcome to Clark County, business as usual, go vote on Tuesday, and there wasn't any information about what was happening with the windstorm. So as an emergency manager, one of the things that we have to do is write after action reports. And that after action report from that windstorm really identified that we needed to figure out how to put stuff online without needing the technical experience to do so, which means that me or my staff that were not technicians could turn on a computer and be able to put information out to say, we are having an emergency and here's what you need to know about what we're doing about it. Now, you would think that that would be a pretty easy thing to accomplish, right? I'm here to tell you that it took us 6 months, 36 meetings with our IT department, and a lot of political energy to be able to figure out how to dynamically put information online. Because a lot of questions came into place. If I put that on the general Clark County website and a couple of 100,000 people try to hit that website and that website crashes, what are the implications for all of the other types of business that might go on in Clark County? What would happen if we didn't have internet connectivity? Would we still be able to share information and update that information? How much privacy would I be risking, or cybersecurity issues would I be risking if people who had no coding knowledge are suddenly tinkering around with a website, right? So there was a lot of different questions and a lot of issues that we had to deal with. But I was one of the first 5 emergency managers across the United States that said, no matter what, the vision is clear. We need to communicate with the general public, and we need to figure out how to make that communication possible. That was in the year 2008, and I was one of the first 5 emergency managers to actually say, we need to figure this out. So I'm going to tell you a lot of stories about how that kind of unraveled and came to be, but that was how I became one of the first emergency managers to focus on bringing social media into everyday communication. Now that has since changed. A couple years ago, I turned 40, and with that, changed jobs again, new career field, and joined the 911 community. So today I stand before you as a 911 technology manager, and I actually manage all the technology for my department back in Clackamas County again, and we are focused on how to bring social and data into the 911 sphere. If you've heard the words next generation 911, it's a big transition that's going on right now. Because right now in 911, we receive voice communication, right? You call 911 for the most part. But in the future world, and actually currently, you can now text 911. But even in the more future world than that, we're going to be receiving pictures, video, streaming video, and different types of data packets from different sources. And so the world of a 911 dispatcher is about ready to completely change from voice-related inputs into data-related inputs. And so that's why I'm in the 911 community now as we're talking about it. So the biggest underlying part of my story is that I have never been afraid to break new ground. I have always asked the question of why not, and let's figure out how to open up communication and share information broadly. And so I'm really self-taught. I heard one of your speakers say that in the last couple of weeks. I literally went to Google and said, teach me how to do this. I watched all of the Common Craft videos. If you go to YouTube and you pull up the words Common Craft, they literally have a whole series of like 30 videos of stick figures. And those stick figures talk about what is social networking, what is RSS feeds, what is the internet. And I will tell you, for a dummy like me, it was gold, because in 3 minutes I could learn a basic concept about social media and be able to translate that into my everyday work environment. So I'm not a technologist by any stretch of the imagination. For those of you that are worried, my husband just walked in. And he will tell you, I still struggle to actually use a remote control on the TV and other types of technology devices, but I've been able to figure out how, by watching how people communicate, social media becomes important in a whole different bunch of venues. So we're going to talk today about what those venues are, and why it makes social media important, and hopefully you'll learn something along the way. But I do want you to feel free to interrupt me. Give me the timeout sign when I talk too fast, because that happens a lot. The more passionate I am about something, the faster I talk about it, which means I'm fine with the slow down or the timeout. So feel free to give me those signs as we move through this presentation. So my personal story also is that I'm also a wife and I'm a mother to 2 kids. You'll see them actually up in the picture there. I already told you I'm a technology manager, and I also have been highly instrumental in writing the curriculum for government employees about how to use social media and emergency management. And so that's why I affectionately, the term got coined SMEM Mama, because that means social media and emergency management. That's the SMEM hashtag on Twitter. And I was one of the first 2. There's me and a gentleman from New Mexico, Jeff Phillips, who's the social media papa. And we affectionately have worked very diligently to bring social media into the world of emergency management. Now, government is a bit unique. When I hire technicians in government, I'm often asking them to be about 10 to 15 years behind the times, because the reality of the legacy equipment that we are using in a government sphere is very old, right? I still have technologies built on Cobalt. I still have technologies. I actually have Windows XP machines that run my radio system. I know, I cringe too. But there's a lot of technology that we have to put in place because it sustains other systems at state and federal levels. So as much as I would love to walk into my environment and virtualize the whole thing, there's no way I can virtualize half of my environments, because all of these different programs are resting on each other, and I need them all to function at local, state, and federal levels. So it's really interesting for me to interview a technician, because a lot of times I interview technicians and they say, oh, I've got all the skill set, latest, greatest, innovative. And I say, I'm going to ask you to step back 10 years and tell me what the technology world was like in 1995. And if you can do that, you're going to be happy in my world. If you can't do that because you are enjoying the innovation that you're working on now, don't even apply for a government position, because you have to have the knowledge and understanding of technology about 10 years ago to be knowing what types of systems I'm working in currently. So why is social media uniquely important? Before reading my slide, any thoughts on why social media is particularly important to our communication field today? Yeah?
Because it's accessible.
It's accessible, right? And what do you mean by that when you say accessible?
Anyone can share with the community.
That is true. Any other types of things? Yeah, back there.
I was just going to say, like, everybody's using it now. Parents, grandparents, kids, like, literally everybody is on social media.
Right. What's the youngest kid you know that's using social media right now? 5? Any other guesses? I should have asked, when do you think my son first touched an iPad or an iPod?
1.
18 months. He's actually on YouTube. There's a YouTube video of him scrolling. And it dawned on me at 18 months that he is not going to learn to type before he learns to swipe and scroll, right? And it's always been his reality. He's now 8, very adept at his iPad. In fact, both of my kids bought their own iPads just this past year, and it's their favorite device in the whole environment. My daughter actually just got a laptop computer about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I'm having to reverse educate her on what it is to work with a laptop because she can't touch it. And she doesn't understand how a mouse works. And Microsoft is really confusing when you've been working in Apple apps for a long time. So it's really interesting to watch that sort of knowledge that we all grew up with, and suddenly they're struggling to sort of reverse engineer and understand what it is to their world. So the reason social media is important to me is it allows any of us to be that citizen reporter, right? We can be anywhere, anytime, any place, and simply by where you are in the world and what you can see, you can share information and be more important than the news reporter who is back in their news station trying to figure out what's going on. In fact, I'm not doing it right now, but my guess is there's a lot of discussion right now about the streets of Portland, where there's a huge protest going on in City Hall after they ratified their police contract today. And I will tell you, social media is probably very vital to how those groups are communicating with each other and communicating with folks on the outside with regards to that protest activity. But the other thing it does is it increases the amount of visual data we have access to. Not unlike this picture that you see behind me, it is a haystack of information. Has anyone in this room ever felt overwhelmed by what is out there in the social internets or the world? Yeah. And why does it overwhelm you?
Too much information.
It's infinite, right? Where do you start, right? And how do you start when you start thinking of looking for things online?
Search terms.
Search terms? Go to Google. Is that the Google, Bing, different search? Of course there is. And there's a million different search results. And depending on what search engine you use, you can get different results based on the algorithms of those search engines, right? Because Google's really smart. And I often tell folks, Big Brother is not your government, folks. Big Brother is Google, who is learning and educating itself and becoming self-aware about everything you search in that engine. Which is why when you go and look at things or for news information, you receive confirming bias information. If you are traditionally conservative, you are going to receive conservative news media first in your news feed. Similarly, same thing happens if you're more liberal and enjoy liberal types of news media. Very first thing you're going to see in your news feed, if you use Google, are things that the internet thinks you will agree with. And so it's very important to understand that these agencies collect information all the time on everyone that's engaging with it. And so it's really important to understand that it quickly becomes overwhelming and quickly becomes kind of frustrating and sort of almost overwhelming just to deal with on a regular basis. But for me as an emergency manager, I still have to sift through that information, right? Because the one thing that social media gives me in this environment is it gives me the pulse on what the public thinks about what I'm doing as a government employee. So it changes for me an emergency response, because back in the old day, we would put out a flyer, right? And we would say, your community has flooded. Show up to this public event and give us your thoughts and feedback. Now I can go online and I can see very immediately whether or not the public buys my storyline, whether or not they agree with what I'm saying, or whether or not they have completely contrary opinions. I used to, in the old days, 10 years ago, be able to have a press conference and have a mayor speaking up on a stage at a press conference and be able to understand that the news media would ask them questions at the press conference, but they would not be calling their news stations until they went outside the door of that room. Now there are opinions that are forming inside press conferences that you have to understand already put the mayor on the defensive or dealing with information before they even walk out of the room, because people are live streaming it, they're tweeting it, they're sharing that information, and people are formulating opinions before the mayor is even done with his or her sentence. And that is really important in a disaster environment, because you may suddenly be talking about that mayor's latest scandal and not about the disaster that's in front of them at any given point in time. So it's really important to be able to listen and put ears on an emergency situation, and that's what social media really gives us, is ears to any type of crisis or disaster. So, why is social media important to any of you guys, or any of us really? The very first couple of examples I want to give you are some really great campaigns or things that kind of initial lessons I learned in social media. The first is my Office Space red stapler debate. When I first got into social media as an emergency manager, I was pretty sure that when we spawned our blog that we were going to have all 400 Clark County citizens signed up and reading the blog. So you probably can imagine my chagrin when we launched the blog and had about 100 people sign up initially. 50 of those were news media sources, and the other 50 were, citizens that were interested in emergency and disaster response. But I'm like, who doesn't want to know about disasters, right? And so we shared information on a regular basis, hey, we're having a preparedness event here, come to this community open house or this fair, and we would share that information. We'd get some pretty okay response. But there was one day I was sitting in my office, and I have a red stapler in my office because I'm a little bit of a geek, and I took a picture of the red stapler and just tweeted that out. Within a couple of minutes, I had hundreds of people talking about my red stapler because they could identify with the movie Office Space and the cubicle land and the environment, and people were exchanging Office Space quotes and all of this other information about the movie and the red stapler. And I literally walked into my boss's office and said, I quit. I talk about emergency management all day and no one cares. I talk about a red stapler and suddenly the world wakes up. But what it taught me in that one environment is it's not about what I say on social media, it's how my message resonates with a community. And if your audience doesn't know or resonate with your message, it's like someone talking in a forest, right? You can talk all day long, but if no one cares about your opinion, do you really have a public opinion, right? I mean, I can tweet, no one agrees with it, no one says anything about it, and if you're not having anyone engage with it, then there's no conversation. For you guys in here, how many folks are on Twitter on a regular basis? Anyone confounded by Twitter, don't really understand it? Excellent. I always describe Twitter as a great dance party, right? You're at a reception, maybe a wedding reception, and you are talking to people at different stages of that reception. Things are going on around you. You walk in, you're talking to one person and saying, hey, we're doing fill in the blank, going to this party next week. And what happens on Twitter is other people observe that communication and can join in and agree or disagree with what's happening. So it's like, instead of email, where you have a one-on-one individual conversation where no one else can listen in, on Twitter, you get the opportunity to have that conversation, but have a whole bunch of eavesdroppers. And if it makes sense or matters to them, they'll jump into the conversation too. And if more and more people jump into the conversation, then you actually have a full discussion going on. And people can walk away, they can, keep talking, or they can say their bit and walk on. But Twitter is very much like a networking reception. You walk in, say your piece, talk about folks, and you find out whether or not there are folks of like mind or like interest area that will take that conversation further. This has been a very important platform for me. I'm on a lot of different platforms. In fact, at last count, I have about 63 different social media accounts. If you're ever looking for me on any type of platform, it's always under Cheryl, BLE, so you can see if I'm there. A lot of the platforms that I'm on really are to explore the use of that platform. So I may wander into a platform and not use it very much, just to kind of see how it functionally works, communicate with a few folks, and then walk away from it. Snapchat's a great example. I understand Snapchat, but there's no part of me that really wants to snap all day long disappearing videos. And there's issues for me in the government world that I can't create disappearing content, because if I do, I have to archive it from a public records request standpoint, and that creates all sorts of dilemmas for me. So as much as some of my friends and family love Snapchat, I'm a lurker, I'm not really an engager. But it's important to understand Twitter for me has been very vital because there's so many people that use it and share information quickly. And so a lot of the examples and a lot of the campaigns I've been involved in have definitely used that platform from an emergency perspective. But I've also been very involved in Facebook campaigns. And I'll talk quickly about the Vote Charter Yes campaign. Do you guys remember the charter 2 or 3 years ago now, when you got to vote on the charter here in Clark County? Whether or not you agree with the charter or the value of the charter in the local county government's politics, I was actually the voice behind the social media side of the Clark Charter Yes. And what was important in that situation was a very hotly contested topic. There were commissioners who were very much opposed to bringing the charter into Clark County, and there was a group of advocates that really wanted to have some type of change in Clark County governance. And that political discussion was sometimes heated and sometimes kind of ugly. And what was interesting about the Charter Yes campaign was that there were several of us that were interested in doing the social media, and we wanted to see if we could keep this discourse civil and have the ability where we didn't have to ban people, didn't have to delete people from various forums or conversation, but could we indeed promote democracy, keep everyone's opinions in the conversation, and give them a forum to share the good, the bad, and the ugly about what was going on with the Charter campaign. So early on, I managed both the social media, the Facebook and the Twitter for this campaign, and I was the primary lead person on social media. We took a commitment off the bat that it would be a success for us if we did not have to delete a single person from that conversation. And I will tell you, by the end of the campaign, we dealt with a lot of different folks that were very negative. Some were name calling, some were attacking people in the forum, some would lived on the East Coast and they would share their opinions at 3 a.m. So every time I woke up, it was like, oh good, another batch of East Coast dissent. And so we tried to deal with it in a lot of different ways that were positive. And the reality was, at the end of the day, only one person had to be banned from that page. Every single other opinion was allowed to continue. And we actually gave the person that we did ban several different opportunities to change his behavior. Because what we found in dealing with people that are really emotional is that a lot of times in a public forum, if you identify that behavior up front, people will often change their own language. So some of the things that we saw was they were using bad, just foul language. So we'd say, hey, we see this, see your post. Really want you to make sure that it stays family friendly, because that's the rules we want to invoke here with our discourse. And then folks would often change their language so it would meet the ideals of our situation. If we got to a second level, we had a second level of response that if they didn't change it but attacked anyone else, then we made sure to let them know we didn't appreciate the attack or what was going on the page, and we were not going to allow behavior on the page that attacked other people. Most people would delete their own posts. We didn't actually have to delete any of their own posts. But what we found is, as long as we continuously recognized the behavior, eventually it petered off and stopped, because it was held accountable every single time. And we were able to very politely say, it's not appreciated. We want your information. We want you to be able to share and do it in a way that is friendly to everyone. And at the end of the day, we only had one person that simply, he went out in a flaming conversation to us as administrators, full of everything we told him not to do. And so we gave him fair warnings, in 30 minutes, this is going to be banned. And sure enough, we did it, and that was fine. But at the end of the day, having several thousand people involved in that conversation, we felt it was still very successful. We were able to engage all the different voices. And so it's important to know your audience and to be able to reach them and share, not just for what you are dealing with directly with people, but for the community around that's having the conversation. Sometimes you're not communicating to the person that's being consistently emotional. Sometimes you're communicating to the village around it to say, hey, it's being caught, it's being recognized, and the rest of us still feel safe enough here to share our information. Another thing that's important is to know your audience. I'm going to give you a great example of NASA. They're one of my favorite folks on social media, because NASA has really had an outstanding social media program to understand that they don't have to have professional marketers if they have geeks that like to share information online. And so if you have followed NASA at all or are a fan of what they've done, they open up a number of different tweet ups and exclusive events to people that share information online. And I actually had the opportunity to go see the unveiling of OSIRIS-REx, which is their mission to Mars. It actually just took off in September of this year. And what they do online is they open up a small window of time, like 1 week worth of sign up for this event. Tell us what your social media accounts are. If you have influence and have a number of folks that follow you and listen to your communication, then we'll select 25 or 50 people to come to a variety of events. And they've done this with launches for a variety of different missions. They've done this for the unveiling of several different missions. And so they give you exclusive sort of backstage pass to what they are doing in their programs. And what is great about this is we all paid our own money to go, right? We got the exclusive access. I received notice on a Friday morning. My husband can attest to how excited I was that Friday morning to say you get to come to Lockheed Martin out in Denver and be here in 2 weeks and share, you can share anything and everything about this mission. What is interesting is when we were on site in Denver, they don't even allow their own employees to share information online. But they allowed the 25 of us to tweet anything, everything. We could Periscope it. We could literally take any social media platform and turn that information into marketing materials for NASA, which they then turned around and retweeted to millions, and they've got tons and tons of followers. And so in just a one-day event where we were out in Colorado, they took over Twitter essentially and a ton of other different media profiles because they corralled the interest and the engagement of folks that were excited about science, folks that were excited about NASA, and folks that were just loving the experience that they put together. And so it's one of those great accounts, particularly in a public agency, that says we don't have a lot of marketing budget, but we can corral the audience to be our marketers and share this information with the world. And you will see NASA do that on a regular basis. The White House has also done it. I also received exclusive access to a one-day event at the White House where we got to go and see all sorts of unveiling of different technologies on their White House Technology Day. And every single person in that room, I think there was 100 of us, were pinching ourselves left and right to how fast we could tweet out. And so it's important to understand that if you know your audience and you know what they're interested in, and that meets the mission of your agency, you can do a lot of interesting and powerful things online. Another great thing is that relationships are really powerful. And I actually have a picture of a guy who's coming to speak with you next week or the week after. This is Dale Chumbley, and I'm not going to take his, he's a real estate agent. You're going to hear from him and his use of social stuff, I believe. But what's interesting, I always tell people that I bought and sold my house on Twitter. And they always look at me and say, how is that possible? And I'll tell you that in the early days of when I was involved in social media, I came home to my street and I found a house I wanted to buy. And on Wednesday night at 6 p.m., I put one tweet out into the world that said, I think I need a real estate agent and a mortgage broker. That's all I said. And within just a few minutes, 3 of my friends had sent me very direct messages about, you need to meet Dale Chumbley. And so I messaged Dale on Twitter and said, hey, I think I need to meet you. We met the very next day at 1 o'clock for a 3-hour conversation. We sold our house within 72 hours of putting it on the market at a bid higher than the market price, with all closing costs included, and we were able to buy the house that we wanted in a very fast transaction. So fast, in fact, that I tease him that there were no flyers in my box. I didn't get the little nifty stand in the front of my house. It was sold that quickly. But it was the power of people making recommendations to me that said, this is the guy that you want to talk to. And sure enough, not only was it the guy we want to talk to, but we were able to buy and sell the house we wanted in a very fast manner because he was recognized as an expert in his profession. Another great example of how powerful relationships are is another friend of ours, and this is our friend Matt Boomla. And I share his story because he bought some tickets on StubHub. Not StubHub, Ticket City, I believe. Yeah, I better get it right. Don't want to offend anyone on video. But so he bought some tickets to the Super Bowl. Total football geek, was so excited. It was the year the Seahawks were going to the Super Bowl. And so he and several buddies of his, or another buddy of his, bought tickets on Ticket City and ended up taking a drive out to the Super Bowl into where it was at that year. I actually don't even remember where it was. You guys probably know. You're better probably at football than I am. So he drove out there, and when they got there to pick their tickets up, the company had oversold the number of tickets that they had for the Super Bowl. And so they got to the hotel in which they were to meet up and get their tickets from the Ticket City. And Ticket City said, we're completely out of tickets. We've oversold, we made a mistake, and we figured, we'll give you some cash instead. They offered him, I think, $1,000 or a couple $1,000 in exchange for the tickets. But this was our friend Matt's dream to go to the Super Bowl. So he posted this tweet online, or picture of him saying, this is as close as I'm going to get to the Super Bowl. So my husband and I both took that picture and shared it on our social media sites and actually said, come on, Ticket City, this is ridiculous. That sharing of both of us resulted in so much of a media firestorm that our friend Matt ended up getting tickets to the Super Bowl within 2 hours of it occurring that Sunday morning. In fact, he was told by the CEO of Ticket City that he has never seen such a storm of interest that was created based on our tweets and the army of people that must surround him that brought them to bear on this. And it was such an interesting story. We just went out with him for dinner a few weeks ago, and he said it was shocking to him because he didn't have much of a social media presence at all. But at the point at which my husband and I simply just shared, this is a bit of a ridiculous moment, a number of our friends reshared it. In fact, KGW here locally put him on air. They took him into, it was Phoenix, Arizona, and he ended up recording a television video there. And then it was rebroadcast all over the nation as these two guys that were out of tickets on the weekend before the Super Bowl. And so it was so fascinating to watch how just, a couple friends of ours, and we just said, hey, this is ridiculous. but it invoked the viral response that he needed, not only to have tickets to the Super Bowl, but to be in the suite next to the NFL commissioner and next to a number of celebrities. He was showing pictures all day long of how he was sitting in the VP seats with all these different celebrities like Paul McCartney and a number of different folks. So he not only had perfect seats, but got them simply by sharing information online. And what's important to note about that is it's the power of relationships. It wasn't Matt's relationships online. It was our relationships online through the networks that we had created. And so by simply sharing that information and the news media interest and the power of that to go viral, his dreams were able to come true. And that was pretty exciting for us. Customer service is also a huge important thing. And there's a couple of great customer service stories. And there's several industries that do great things on social media because they already know their audience, they understand what their audience needs, and they're not afraid to engage with their audience. And so the first picture you see on here is Delta Airlines. And I will tell you, how many of you have had the experience of leaving something on an airplane? Something, your glasses, something, what have you left behind?
My wallet.
Your wallet, ooh, scary.
Yeah.
What'd you leave behind, Christine?
Coat.
Yeah, coat. All right. So you know how frustrating that is, right? You leave it behind, and I was on a flight that was flying through a city, and I was late to my next flight. So I knew that once I jumped off that plane, I had to catch another plane within less than an hour. But what I left behind was my Kindle. And I'm a huge avid reader, and I love my Kindle. So I jumped off the plane, got on the other plane, went to pull my Kindle out, and said, oh no, it's not in my bag. And obviously I left it in seat 17G where I was sitting and left it right behind where I put it while the plane was landing. So what was interesting was our plane had stopped. I talked to the flight attendant and said, I left this online. She goes, you're going to have to call customer service when you get off the plane. Well, we hadn't taken off yet. We had about 20 minutes. And so I tweeted at Delta Airlines and said I was on this flight from Portland to, I think Salt Lake City actually. And I said I was in seat 17G and I left my Kindle behind. And so then I flew my next leg. I can't even remember where I was going. But I flew that next leg and I landed, turned my phone back on, and Delta Airlines tweeted me back saying the Kindle should meet you at the desk of where you landed. And sure enough, I got off that plane and the Kindle was waiting for me. It had made a faster flight than I had made to my destination, and they had it ready to give me as soon as I jumped off the plane. Now, in the old days when I was, would have called customer service, I would have had to probably drive to PDX 5 or 6 days later and get that Kindle. But I was so excited because it was my flight of wherever I was going, so I had my Kindle for the return flight home. But it was just an example of how in customer service, if you know your audience and can deal with the needs of your customers, you can alleviate some of the concerns that come to your call centers and the help desks and the frustration that people might feel later in life. My Wendy story is an interesting story of woe from this summer. Bruce is already laughing because he knows what this story is about. We went, my daughter and I, son and I had a very busy Sunday. And we were driving all around to a bunch of different events. My daughter was getting ready to go to summer camp the next day, and we literally had, I think, 5 or 6 different meetings. So on the way to one meeting where I was dropping her off, my son said, I really would love to have some Wendy's. And I knew I had about $5 in dollar bills and cash and then some change in the console of my car. And so we stopped, and I thought, they've got a dollar menu. So we went through the drive-thru, and his meal was $4.17. Now, at the end of that, I had one cash dollar left, and this will become more important in a second. Because we got his meal, dropped him off, took him to his events. I picked my daughter up just before going to get my son again. And my daughter's like, what did Hunter have what did he have for his dinner? And I said, oh, he had Wendy's. And he's like, oh, I'd love to have Wendy's too. And as a mom, you think, okay, I got to be fair, right? Both kids should have the same meal. So I said, well, I know this meal is $4.17. See if I have $3.17 of change in the console. So she did. And sure enough, within a minute, she had $2.17, and I still had the dollar cash left over from my son's experience. And so we went up to the Wendy's drive-thru, ordered the exact same thing, and I got to the drive-thru window and said, I'm really sorry about this, but I don't have paper cash. Gave him the dollar and said, here's the $3.17. And the gal at the drive-thru looked at me, and her manager was coming right by, and he said, oh, we don't do that. We don't take change, and you're going to have to, go away. So he turned the change back to me, and they had already given me the drink by that point. And so I was just shocked. I kind of gave the drink back, and I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. And so walked away from there, and I was like, it was cash, right? I'm like, this wasn't Canadian change. What did I do? And so when we got to pick up my son, I tweeted out a real simple tweet that said, apparently change doesn't matter at Wendy's. They've just lost a customer, or my customer, the value of me as a customer is $3.17 or something like that. So within a few minutes, friends started sharing it, tweeting it, retweeting it. I put it on Facebook as well. Some of my friends actually called the Wendy's store in question, asked for the district manager's name, gathered a bunch of information, said, we're going to have, an army of people showing up with change tomorrow. So we really hope that you're going to handle this situation appropriately. Several different news media outlets called me. Apparently it was a slow enough news day. They wanted to broadcast me in front of the Wendy's. And I said, no, wait a second. It's not even been 24 hours. And I can at least give a manager the grace to say maybe he was having a bad night. Maybe, my drive-through was the last thing he needed to see. I said, I really want to give Wendy's 24 to 48 hours to see if they'll even respond to the information. So of course, that didn't stop my husband from showing up the next day with change, and he was treated properly. In fact, he showed up with change several days and had a good experience. So I knew it wasn't a policy issue. And Wendy's ended up calling me back, actually their district manager, and profusely apologized. They actually wrote a nice letter of apology and sent us $100 in gift cards and encouraged us to be generous with those funds. And so we did. We started going to Wendy's drive-thru and not only paying for our meal, but paying for the car behind us. And so we all summer have been able to buy people's meals as we go through Wendy's and turn that customer service experience into a really positive lesson for our kids. So say, you know what? You speak up when it's not right, but you also give people the grace and the space to be able to come to a good resolution, because you don't need to shame everyone online. There are situations where people need to have the ability to respond to you in an appropriate manner, and you have to give people the ability to do that. You can't just rush to judgment, because it's easy to do on social media. One other important reason social media is important is that listening is critical. One of the things that I get to do as an emergency manager is deal with virtual operations support teams. And these are teams of volunteers that watch and listen to social media. They sometimes never tweet out a thing, but they gather information for emergency responders so that they know whether or not their messages are being heard, understood, and what the rumors and the misinformation are. And so virtual operations support teams have been an ability for us to be very involved in high-profile security and emergency type events. We've had the experience of our teams being involved in very high-profile shootings, bombings, and a number of different emergency situations. Just last summer, about a year ago actually, in the Douglas County shooting down in Roseburg, I had the opportunity to be the team leader for the Umpqua Community College shooting for several days. And in that situation, we were able to identify copycats, additional folks that were intent on carrying out the mission of the original shooter, threats to the president, as well as threats in the community, as well as a lot of false donations and scams that were popping up, because when an emergency happens, everyone likes to try to make a dollar. And they will do it by selling, stickers, t-shirts, running fake 5Ks, setting up GoFundMe accounts that are not full of real information. And so we were vitally involved for 17 days during that mission, identifying how to help the community of Roseburg come back online and recover from a terrible shooting situation. And these teams are involved all over in 32 different states here in the United States, and we have 18 teams overseas that work on a variety of different international situations that include very significant issues like terrorism and bombings overseas. And so it's important to understand that social media isn't just about putting information out online, it's also about listening to what the public is doing online. Because I will tell you, for every smart person involved in social media, there's a lot of dumb people involved in social media, and they share information about their criminal activities and their desires and their intent 5 times much more often than the smart people. And so it's really interesting to see people will give away their location. They will coordinate bank robberies. I mean, it's phenomenal. If you know where to look and you know what you're looking for, it's pretty crazy what you can find online. So what can you learn if you listen? I always tell folks it's important to look for the energy hubs online. Before the world of the internet, we used to have coffee shops and different restaurants where people would go to bulletin boards, right? And they would say, come to this community event or go here. And community bulletin boards are still in use in a lot of communities. And they have to be, because technology doesn't always work. But there's also those listening hubs online as well. A great example of this is when we had a little bit of an earthquake here in Southwest Washington a couple of years ago. And of course, as the Clark Regional Emergency Service person, we put out, did you feel it, right? Hoping people would share their experience about feeling the earthquake. And I will tell you that where people shared that information was on the Vancouver Mall's Facebook page. Because within about an hour, I had about 30 people sharing that information on Cressa's Facebook page. In that same half an hour, 910 people shared if they felt it on the Vancouver Mall Facebook page. So what that taught me as an emergency manager was not so much that if I shared the information it was important, but I better make sure that Vancouver Mall shares my emergency information, because Vancouver Mall will get far more engagement than I would as a public safety agency. So it's really important to understand, to find your energy hubs in your community. Where do people share, and where is that information building a network and an audience? It's not always us, right? It's not, if I share it, it's not going to go golden. But if I find the right people sharing the information at the right times, you can find a lot of critical information online. Reputation and credibility is also important. As much as you can build a good reputation online, you can destroy that reputation in one tweet. And there's story after story of people who have lost their jobs, people who have lost their relationships, people hopefully who have lost presidential campaigns. Not yet, sorry, a little too early. But it is crazy to me to see the amount of things that people will share in a heartbeat online that goes directly to the reputation that they build as individuals. And so I will talk a little bit more about my own reputation in this regard in a few minutes. But it's important to know that your credibility can go away in a very, very short basis based on what you share. It's also important to build trust. You can identify a lot about information based on what people share online. I often look, when people want to follow me on different social media accounts, I look at what they share too and see whether or not we are people that would be friends, would be perhaps colleagues or acquaintances, or are they sharing stuff that I simply will never agree with and will simply raise my blood pressure when I see it posted online. And so you can learn a lot about who people are based on what they share in online situations. I've talked already about interest and engagement, knowing your audience, the importance of, you can share a lot of information online, but if no one interacts with it, you have to really look at what the type of information is that you're sharing. Because obviously it's not resonating with other folks, or people are avoiding it because maybe they're concerned about the volatility of what you're sharing. I always ask folks, why do you think food and cats are really popular online? Any ideas? What's that? It's accessible, right? Safe, you can relate to it, right? But what's more important than just relating to it is it's not judgmental. If I share a picture of my lunch online, you can either like or dislike the food, but it doesn't immediately divide you like religion and politics do. If I share something online that is innately political about my own political beliefs, immediately you're going to love it or hate it based on where you sit on the political spectrum. If I share a picture of a cat or a dog or travel or food, I can immediately engage with that regardless of how I feel about you as a person. And the important thing is you see this a lot by maybe those family members that tweet information and you're like, oh, my uncle, again. And you realize when he shares a picture of a cat or a dog, I can immediately like it because I don't have to agree with his religion or politics to agree with the fact that he shared a nice picture of a dog. And so it's important to understand that the way you share online also has to give people the option to agree with you. You can't go one-sided into social media and be like, this is my issue, and I'm going to sit on that issue until the day I die, because it will immediately divide your audience and perhaps not get you the access you want to the audience you're looking for. It's also important to know the internet causes a lot of confusion. There's a lot of rumor and misinformation that is out online all the time, and I'm going to talk about this kind of in a few minutes, but it's important to understand that things are not always crystal clear. And when you see something online like Patrick Swayze has died again, it's probably, well, we know he did die, but there's a number of actors today that get reported as being dead all the time, and people will rush to share that information and realize they haven't died yet, but it is an ongoing issue for social media. And then customer service concerns. You have to not be afraid of your customers. And I get this experience a lot when I consult with different agencies of what happens if something posts something negative, right? What do I do with negative feedback? And I always say don't fear it, because in every ounce of feedback, there is an element of truth. Even if that person is lying about your agency or your mission, there is something that bothers them about what either your agency stands for or a message that you put out. And so it's really important to listen to that and say, what is it that is causing this type of response from this type of community member? And so it's important to say, hey, we're not perfect. We might have things we can fix, but it is important to understand that we can, that not to be afraid of that. Bruce is looking at his clock. Does that mean I'm way
No,
behind
I
time?
was just checking with my wife on dinner.
Oh, excellent. So some of you might be wondering, how do you listen online, right? Because if I set you loose in front of a computer and say, go listen to the internet, you're probably going to be like, where do I even start, right? But there's a number of different things that are important for if you're going to engage with social media from a business perspective. One is you have to be familiar with social media capabilities. You can't just assume what Twitter will do for you without actually being on Twitter and figuring out what it can do for you. You have to be someone with an account that watches and sees how the communication is going. Because even in the 8 years that Twitter has been around, communication has changed on Twitter as well. It has become much more marketing driven and a lot less relationship driven. And I find that I use it even differently today than I did back in 2008. And it's important to understand what those capabilities can do for you and can do from you from an agency perspective. So it's important to know Facebook, it's important to know Twitter. Photo and video sharing like Instagram, YouTube, Snapchat, and Periscope are also things to become familiar with and get visual. And even just using social media to gather your daily news. Begin to look at the news media stories online because they break so much faster online than they do by watching the 6 o'clock or 11 o'clock news. It's also important to learn how to search social media. And I'll put these words up here, and I'm not going to do a good job explaining them today, but Boolean math. Understanding how to do a search screen that says I want to search for cats and dogs, but not Cocker Spaniels. And understanding that there is actually a formula you can put in a search string that will include and exclude different types of things that you might be looking for. So for example, when I'm searching Twitter for information, I often exclude the word retweet because I don't care how many times something gets retweeted when I'm looking for original threat-based information after a shooting. And so you can include and you can exclude information really easily by understanding there's only 4 words in Boolean math. It's either and, or, not. Oh, and the fourth one, what's the other one? Oh, the quotation marks. And so by putting quotation marks around words, strings them together, so it links them together, and using and, or not allows you to create a search string that includes or excludes different things. It's also important to understand geofencing. I can go into some of these social sites and put a latitude, longitude into a social site, and it brings all the content for a certain area around a geographic location. So for example, when I work in a 911 center, I look at the 25 miles around my 911 center because what I want to know is who's sharing information closest to me in my jurisdiction. When we did searches for the Umpqua Community College shooting, we looked for everything around the college, we looked for everything in Roseburg, we looked for everything in Oregon, everything in the United States, and then everything internationally. And the reason that we did that is we were looking for trends and who was sharing information in different spheres. And that was how we found out different protest groups were coming in from outside of the Roseburg area into the Roseburg area to begin to protest some of the funerals. And so it's important to understand that if you can change those search parameters, you can see what the local conversation is and what the broader conversation is. Also, you can use different things like social aggregators. You guys know how simple it is to go to google.com and put in a search term? There are social aggregators which look like a Google search bar that actually search blogs and news media articles and different types of social accounts. There's things like Ice Rocket and Topsy, and I'm forgetting some of the social mention that are actually aggregators that search social sites. And you can go in and use search strings to say what has been talked about for the last 24 hours, 72 hours, week, or 3 months. And you can kind of narrow down the conversation to before an event or after an event in order to listen to what information is being shared online. So that is a real rough sketch of like a 10-hour presentation I normally do on social media listening. So the other thing I would say it's important to understand on social media is crowdsourcing. Who in here understands what crowdsourcing is? Yes. Back in the back. You. Yeah?
Oh, it's where you have something that you want to do, or a company or something, you go out and get people to put in money. Like somebody's house is burned down, you do group
So crowdsourcing can be fundraising. It can be, but essentially it is putting a problem out into the social world and asking the community to come with a solution. And I'm going to share a couple of examples of how I've done this in the world. One is, I had a great example of when I worked at the Clark Regional Emergency Services Agency. I received a call from the Clark County Jail. And they said, I've got several pallets of meals ready to eat, and they're about ready to expire. In fact, they expire in about 30 days. We don't want to throw them in a landfill, and so what can I do with these meals ready to eat? So I did what every traditional emergency manager does. I notified all of our community organizations by email and said, we've got several pallets of these meals ready to eat. Anyone, any takers? And of course, crickets. Nothing on email, right? Because who wants to figure out what to do with several pallets? So we let it go for a couple of days and decided I'm going to put a tweet out and see if anyone has a good idea of what to do with these pallets for meals ready to eat. And within 5 minutes, we had 3 solutions. One was to pick up the meals ready to eat and deliver it to several veterans groups that were in the area. One was to go distribute it to a homeless population that was nearby. One was to go along the Washington coast and deliver it to homeless communities that were up and along the coast area. All 3 solutions came with transportation, pickup times, and the ability for them to carry out what the solution was that they had requested. So without even having these pallets show up on my doorstep, I was able to coordinate a response to get those pallets out to feed the homeless populations in and along the Washington coast with several vans that a community group pulled together. Took the meals ready to eat off the jail's hands, and they did not show up on my doorstep. And so a simple example of community solution, because I didn't care what happened to them, I just didn't want them to show up on my doorstep. And we had another situation. We were clearing out 3-ring binders left and right around middle of August. And I had hundreds of 3-ring binders, because if you work in government, your plan is not good unless it can fit in about a 3-inch 3-ring binder. And so we were getting rid of it. We were able to archive a lot of the information and make it digital. But I had all these 3-ring binders. And so I posted, I said, I got like 100 3-ring binders. And several different teachers came by and picked up all those 3-ring binders within 2 hours. And so I didn't have to take them even outside of my office. We had them come on in, pick them up, and we were able to solve that issue, put it to good use when I would have probably just otherwise recycled or thrown them in the garbage. So crowdsourcing and the power of crowdsourcing is being able to find solutions when you don't care really what happens to it, but the community can come up with a good idea of how to solve your problem. And there's a lot of those. You watch Kickstarters, you watch a number of innovation and creative ideas that people say, all right, world, tell me whether or not this idea has merit or not, and vote with your money. And so people will do that through Kickstarter projects and support good ideas, or they won't support good ideas, and you get a good understanding of whether the market will bear what it is you're looking for. The other big crowdsourcing issue for me in public safety world is solving crime with social media. In fact, Canada was one of the very first social media locations in a government public sphere where they started using Crime Stopper and graffiti solutions, where they would simply post pictures of graffiti up in Toronto and have the community either go out and solve the graffiti by covering over it, or identify the folks that were involved in creating the graffiti. And that has turned into a very powerful program up in Toronto, where the police actually now partner with graffiti artists to identify where appropriate locations are to do graffiti and where not appropriate locations are. And so it's turned into a great community initiative to say this can be art, and it can be sanctioned and given a space, and it doesn't have to become an us-them law enforcement situation. And so a great example of how to do crowdsourcing with your community. So the benefits of social media for me and for many others are the development of partnerships, being able to identify funding, getting your own messages amplified or amplifying the messages of others, and really just understanding sort of the freshness of ideas that are out there in the community. It's so much better to engage and have those conversations and see what the feedback is for some of the ideas that you have or want to do in our world. But social media is not all happy-go-lucky. There are downsides. I will tell you, for those of you not involved in social media, I'll probably now make a case for why you should never be on social media. Because it's really important to understand that no matter how great social media is, it does come with potential costs. And some of those costs are, there's a lot of fake information out there. In fact, just this very weekend, I saw the shark picture. Anyone else see the shark picture online? Being broadcast as one of the impacts of the flooding situation in the southeastern part of the United States. This picture has been circulating the internet now for about 9 years. And you see it in almost every flooding situation that occurs. And sadly, it was even shared by one of my own relatives this week. I'm like, how many times have I told you this is a fake story? But we grow fearful of the unknown. And we also love to share visual information first. And so I will tell you, I do a lot of virtual teams for hurricane type situations. And within the first hurricanes and tornadoes. And within the first 5 to 10 minutes of any good tornado, I see pictures from Katrina and earlier every single time, because people go to Google, search tornado, and they're like, I saw it. And so you're like, nope, that was the tornado in Ohio. Nope, that was the tornado in Oklahoma. And so you're just almost kind of playing whack-a-mole with like the rumors and misinformation in the first few minutes online. And so you'll see the New York subway filled with water. That's a very common one, where the water goes down the stairs. You'll see the shark one. You'll even see in wildfire situations the picture of the wildfire with the deer, where the whole kind of hillside looks on fire. That was actually a picture from 2000 in Montana about a picture of a wildfire. Yet when Oregon and Washington had all those wildfires a couple of years ago, that picture was front and center on everyone's Facebook page for several days. And it should have been telling, because that picture has now atrophied so bad, it looks like an old picture online. But people are still sharing it as though we saw this just at the end of our street. Sure you did. So it's important to know. Yes?
The media is a caught.
Yes.
I've seen TV stations that they'll post something,
Yep.
that, and, like, they won't retract it, they just won't say anything else about it.
Right. And very famous reporters. I mean, there's even, I love NPR, and NPR has been caught several times doing where they will launch a story first and it doesn't have validation. And when I work with public information officers, we always say, if you see something unique online, you need to verify it with at least 3 sources in order to determine whether or not this is the only person sharing that information, or can you validate it through either direct messaging that person to say, hey, was this your source, or doing even metadata. You can right click on a lot of images and see what day they were uploaded to Google. And so what's interesting is you can look at the metadata of the pictures and say, this is an old picture, by simply right clicking and looking at the properties. Now that doesn't stop people from uploading old pictures, right? But you are able to sometimes see that information very, very quickly. I had a city one time that called me and said, we're having a shooting in our airport. It's a live situation. And we're very confused because there are pictures online right now of our officers that are not actually physically at that airport, and they're in uniform. And so we went in, looked at the metadata of the pictures. Sure enough, they were pictures of law enforcement officers from several years prior of when they had been in that airport for other types of emergency drills. And so very quickly you can identify that someone was just, saying, this is this airport and this is the shooting, and it simply was not true. What is interesting about social media is that rumor and false information does seem to clear up faster than it does for the fog of war in real life. So when you go into a shooting or a large situation and there's so much rumor, misinformation, there is a lot faster tendency, and a lot of researchers are studying how fast social media deals with some of those rumors. But if the truthful information can persist as long as the rumor does, you're able to tamp down that rumor. Now, that's not always the case. There was a very significant situation in the Boston Marathon bombing where there was rumors that an 8-year-old female runner had been killed in the Boston Marathon. That rumor persisted for days. And despite local authorities saying there was no 8-year-old runner, there was no 8-year-old runner killed in the bombing, they only tweeted it several times, and they didn't persist the truth long enough to tamp down the rumor. So for several days, it was a constant story about this, missing 8-year-old that really was just a rumor and something that never had happened. What's also important to realize online is that people get extremely emotional and polarized. Anyone seen examples of that in the past few months? I almost have to take a social media break, I will be honest. Because I love social media and I love being able to communicate in it, but the polarization of the communication is really at an all-time high. And it's really important, and I tell, because I work with a number of different folks in elected official capacity and public capacity, that I say if your blood pressure is going up when you're writing that post, step away from your computer and do not hit send, because you will always regret information that you share when your emotions are high. And so I always say, leave that post, you can write it out, get it out of your system that you want to write it, but walk away from the machine for at least a couple of hours, if not a full day. Come back to it and see if you still feel as strongly about the post at a later time. Because anything you say in the emotional heat of a moment, just like a fight in real life, you will live to regret it, because you will not intend that when your blood pressure has gone down and you have thought through the situation. And it's important to understand that we all have to engage in that, because we see things online all the time, right? They're like, oh, can't believe I just saw that. And it's important to realize that we read in a lot of tone where there may or may not be intended the same amount of tone. Because what happens is we get the blood pressure response and we think they posted it in the same level of blood pressure that we perceived it as. And sometimes that is not the case. They may have been trying to make a witty joke that you caught in a wrong moment. And so it's really important to kind of step back and say, there can be a lot of reasons and a lot of context for that post. And so, I do a lot of walking by the various types of posts and not baiting into it. But I often tell folks, if you need to bait into it once, do it once and walk away. Don't keep feeding the dragon of the emotion. Because the more emotional you get, you will not calm a situation down, ever. Which means you need to step back and say, I've said my piece and I am moving on. Because it really doesn't feed the overall community discourse for us to be so polarized. And I think particularly in today's day and age, we all need to take additional responsibility really to return to a much more civil discourse. And I think it's partly in fault to social media being anonymous, right? I could go on there and I can talk to someone in a very anonymous format, even though they see my first and last name for the most part, but I don't see their face. I don't see their history, their background, or their story. And so sometimes you're hitting people in ways that you might not do if you were actually talking to them face to face. Third thing I'm going to say is there are trolls online. There are people who live online to raise your blood pressure, and they intend to do so. And the way you know that they're a troll is if they'll take both sides of the same issue and go after you with completely polar opposing ideas. One day they're against abortion, one day they're pro-abortion, and back and forth, and you cannot pin them down on a particular position because all they are wanting to do is to get you to respond emotionally. And this happens in any type of business environment. In all of the jobs I have had, will have people that will always try to bait me saying, I know your job better than you do, or this is going on and you don't know about it. And what they're doing is trying to bait and get that emotional response from you. And so that's why I put the don't feed the trolls. Always look for what the communication is to the people around them that you are talking to and what type of example you can set to say, I'm going to respond to the information, but I'm going to respond in a way that is kind, that is polite, and able to provide the information the community needs. And finally, I'm going to talk real quickly about reputation. You see the cracked eggs up there, and I think it's a funny moment if you follow my Cooking with Cheryl stories, is I have a lot of different personalities online. I do my emergency management, I do kind of my geeky moments, I talk with a lot of friends, but I left some eggs on the oven one day and went and did an art project somewhere else in my house. Boiled eggs, not that hard, in water. The water all dissipated over a certain point in time, and then they exploded. So the eggs, this is actually a picture of the real eggs. They exploded, smelled like burnt hair, it was terrible. And so I hashtagged it Cooking with Cheryl, because I'm not a good cook. Of all the things I do, cooking is not my forte. And that tweet ended up having quite the conversation about it. And so every time I have a disastrous cooking experience, I will simply use the words Cooking with Cheryl just to illustrate what's going on. And there have been some great stories. Like I made gumbo one night and didn't realize you had to stir it for 3 hours. And so I'm like, oh, my phone's at 100% charge, and I'm going to stir it for 3 hours and tweet Gumbo with Cheryl. So people got a whole 3-hour lesson on how to make gumbo. It actually turned out okay. But what's important is when I go speak, and I speak all over the country about social media, the number one thing that people ask me about are either Cooking with Cheryl tweets or my birth control tweets, where I try to encourage people maybe they should rethink having children because of my parenting experiences. Not that I love my children and have had great experiences, but what I tweet about them are the ones that say you might want to rethink becoming a parent because my hairbrush just ended in a toilet, or a variety of different things that my kids have done to me over the years. So it's important to understand that no matter how smart I can be about social media, I can't escape the Cooking with Cheryl hashtag, because it's the number one question I get of like, what's the last thing you cooked? In fact, it was so funny that Andrew Zimmern of Bizarre Food started following me on Twitter, and then I started really freaking out because I'm like, real chefs are going to now start judging my ability to cook or not. So occasionally people try to bait Gordon Ramsay and different folks just to, with my Cooking with Cheryl hashtag, and it gets really embarrassing. So far I've not been invited on any cooking shows, but there are lots of requests for me to live share my information or to live stream my ability to cook or inability to cook. So finally, I just want to kind of close out with talking about the important thing in social media is you need to build a strong network. You need to judiciously look at who you're following, follow those people that interest you. You do not have to follow everyone online because they follow you first. right? That's the great thing about social media, is that I can follow people that are of unique interest to me. So I follow a lot of 911 folks, emergency managers, folks in the local community and different businesses. But if your interests are like fishing and golf, you can find the folks that are tweeting and sharing information about fishing and golf. And if you don't like what you're seeing in your Twitter feed, you have the power to curate that, because you have the ability to unfollow people and they never even get a notice. So it's important for you to really build a strong network of folks that you get to know and get to talk to and really begin to have those conversations online. I also recommend being real genuine and of good character. Don't be baiting people. Don't be getting into troll-like behavior. Don't always be arguing online. Look to see what good information that you can share that might be of interest to your audience. And it's important to know who's following you, what makes you interesting to someone else. Because when you do that, you'll get involved in really good conversations and find those people that can help you when there's a exercise or something that you want to work on. It's also important to be aware of what's relevant. And cultural trends, of course, pass us by every day, right? But there's a real interest sometimes in wanting to share information like different memes or things as they're funny and popular to the general public. And I will tell you a great example of one night way back when the very first Sharknado movie was created. Did anyone watch the first movie live? So the Red Cross did. And a couple of different emergency managers caught it that night when it was on. I didn't have cable, so I actually didn't catch it on my TV, but I did start catching the Red Cross starting to tweet about it. And the folks that were communicating about that Sharknado created quite the Twitter storm online. People were questioning whether or not there could be a tornado of sharks, how great the movie was, how the budget was, and of course the B actors that were in it. And I'll tell you, that Twitter storm for that night resulted in more communication about emergency management than any other popular culture moment ever. And what was funny from an emergency manager's perspective is some of my peers started tweeting about it 2 or 3 weeks later. And I'll tell you, it was a dead audience by then because no one was watching it online. It was really funny to tweet about it with people that were watching the movie on that 2-hour window, not as funny 2 weeks later. And so it's important to understand that sometimes the arc of culture goes by us very quickly. And if something was popular a week ago, it might not be so popular today. And so it's really important to kind of gauge, is there still a conversation going on about that? Or is it something that we have to wait to be relevant on for the next time around? It's also important to be opportunistic. Be ready to pivot your message at any point in time if you're from an agency. A great story of this happened during the Super Bowl. Does anyone remember when the power went out at the Super Bowl a couple years ago? It was, I think, third quarter. Power went out just after halftime, and Oreo Cookie, in that moment, said, "You can dunk in the dark." And they created that on the fly during the Super Bowl, a little bit of Oreo and some milk, and that message, they estimated, had a value of $53 million from Oreo Cookie being able to share the amount of times that got shared in the Super Bowl, all because they were simply opportunistic with the message. And everyone else was still tweeting their pre-planned tweets to the Super Bowl and all their marketing messages, but whoever the genius was at Oreo that simply created that one little graphic was of huge value to that organization. It's also really important to know your agency's mission. What is it that you're out in the world about? What is your story, right? Because if I'm an agency that's talking about emergency preparedness, then when I get into that conversation about Sharknado, perfectly timely for me. But if you're a different organization and you don't have a connection to that cultural relevant moment, then it seems just weird and awkward, right? It's like that cool kid or not so cool kid at the party that says, "Hey, what about this?" And you're like, "Yeah, not funny," just not as relevant. And so you have to know your own mission so well that you can look at, what is my connection to that story? What is my connection to making it unique to the organization in which I serve? And so I always tell folks, if politics and religion are not the mission of your organization, you don't need to be in those conversations online. But if they are in the mission of your organization, you need to know your political values and your religion so well that you can engage and be inclusive of that conversation in order to make sure that you don't lose your audience. And that's particularly true for political officials who are trying to get more people into their camps, right? They need to know their audience, understand what the values are, understand what they stand for, and how to relate to that audience. Nothing is different about being online that way. So that's all basically I have in terms of social media, but I want to open it up to you guys in terms of questions. I've shared a lot of great stories, and I hope that you've enjoyed that, but happy to take any questions or a conversation that you might have. Yes?
A good example is going on right now. My hometown is in Moore County, North Carolina. They're facing a dam that's getting ready to break. It's been on the news. It's called Wood Lake Dam.
Yep.
A lot of my friends are actually bears. I mean, people I grew up with. And I used to be involved in emergency services way back then.
Yeah.
But anyway, one thing they're doing is, besides that, I mean, right now, like people are posting drone pictures and things like that. It's being fed into. You look up Moore County Public Safety on Facebook.
Yep.
And they have a big presence. They're putting out. They have blogspot.com.
Yep.
They're linking to for public releases.
Yep.
I've been following real time, where you get the news, but I hear from this stuff. Also, the one closed.
Yeah, no, there's closed and open groups, and there's a lot of ways that you can help in a community. There's in any kind of emergency situation, there is way more work than the public officials can handle. But figuring out how to plug into those emergency environments can be really useful, and that's why using social tools and saying we need sandbaggers here in this location, we need donation managers here, and really plugging into that is really a huge value for social media.
Mayor of the county seat.
Yeah.
North Carolina.
Absolutely.
He's doing that. He's doing that. Finding people to volunteer. These people are supposed to see Facebook.
Yep. Yeah. It's interesting. When we do virtual teams all across the United States, one of the first things we do is identify the lay of the land, figure out where are people huddling in that community. And you do see a real difference in rural areas. It's a lot more Facebook than it is Twitter. In very urban environments, the larger the city, the more the Twitter presence, or even the more, depending on the age group, if it's a college campus, they might be in things like Yik Yak or things that are more text-based and more anonymous. And so it's interesting, depending on where sort of the hazard or threat profile is, kind of where that community huddles. And so it's important to kind of figure out where that audience is. But in rural areas, it tends to be a lot more Facebook driven. Yes?
Okay, so just worst case scenario. At 7:15 tonight, there's an 8.1 earthquake.
Yep.
Takes out Bonneville, takes out most of the power infrastructure locally, and for a while people have battery backup with their phones and everything. But assuming basically all this stuff goes away, what do you do then?
So that's a great question, and a question I get a lot actually about what happens when there is absolutely no network infrastructure. The ham radio, certainly a great option, but I will also tell you that the research of big international disasters, particularly around Haiti and other locations where they don't have very good technology, there's never been a completely technology blackout. Because what happens is, so we have the large earthquake here, then automatically DC, the folks on the East Coast begin moving infrastructure items as close as they can get to us. And a lot of the technical companies will bring things like cellular on wheels, cows, and different types of infrastructure to reset that up in a variously affected location. And what's really interesting, when I tell folks about preparedness in today's day and age, cell phone batteries should trump anything else in your preparedness kit. Because the longer you can keep your cell phone battery alive, the more you can get connected to the various networks. And the cell networks are relatively redundant among the different carriers and providers. So we have yet to see, and I keep waiting for it. Now, Japan was a very interesting disaster in 2011 when they had the tsunami, right? There were definitely areas of huge blackout because of the tsunami area. But on that same day, 400 million Twitter accounts were spawned out of Japan alone to begin to communicate information about that disaster. So even though there are areas where there's complete blackout, Oso landslide was another one up on the SR 530 area where there's a blackout there, but people immediately brought communication as close as they could get to it, and they were still tweeting out of Snohomish County pretty handily. So that being said, it's not that I'm not a believer that it will go down at some point. I also believe there are things we need to worry about with the power grid and different cyber issues in our future for certain. But it is important to understand that infrastructure does move as quickly as it can to bring some of that stuff up. And sometimes we make the assumption that the power's out, and so therefore information can't transpire. And I had a local government actually in Clackamas County a few years back, huge windstorm, power was out all throughout near Mount Hood area, and their elected officials came to the very next meeting and asked their emergency manager, we all had our cell phones, we were still communicating, but yet you weren't posting anything online. The emergency manager was like, well, that's because the power was out. And they're like, yeah, but it wasn't on our phones. And so you have to be very careful about making assumptions about who's communicating where. We also saw really interesting trends around the Boston Marathon bombing, not so much with what was happening in Boston, but how people were communicating it around the United States, because a lot of people had runners who are from all sorts sorts of states that had qualified, and so there was still a need to communicate to folks in and around outside the Boston area about what was happening there. So it's important to really think that communication, kind of happens at a variety of different levels, but certainly we could go without in a large earthquake here. There was another hand back here, I think, or up front.
Well, so you mentioned 10 years, the retrospective 10-year thing, looking in your organization back, status of the technology is sort of from the 10-year period before to now, but what about looking forward into the future 10 years? Expert systems, Watson-like systems, automated, expert systems?
That's a really good question. I sit on a lot of federal committees right now trying to sort that out for emergency services. And what we're seeing a lot is a trend towards automating data. And so some of the trends that we anticipate is a lot of information will be sent via sensor as opposed to actually manually manipulated. So for example, my police and firefighters right now, between webcams on police uniforms, we have firefighters who are looking at biometric suits, that communicate their blood pressure and oxygen intake when they go into a fire situation. And the big question for us at an emergency management community is who will analyze the data, right? I mean, you've got all the sensory data coming in, but who makes the decision on whether or not it's a life safety issue? And so that is something that our police and our emergency services and our firefighters are really beginning to have to wrestle with. Data's great, but how do we not create that haystack for ourselves and miss something? Things are also getting a lot more visual, so we anticipate a much more live streaming video. But how do you determine as a dispatcher what's important about a live streaming video for an officer safety perspective? So lots of, if I were in the technology world today and studying technology as you might be, I would be looking at getting into augmented reality. I would be looking at getting into data issues because, augmented reality more because of the cookie crumbs that you can leave into the environment of any different area, right? So museums are beginning to use it to add to their exhibits and displays. It's becoming much more accessible to folks for using it, but also from a training perspective, being able to train law and fire folks virtually as opposed to sending them into structure burns, it's also becoming really important. But I would also be looking at databases, the interrelationship of different systems, and SQL databases, huge, not an area of skill set that I have, but something that folks need to be focused on. And then also from a policy and governance perspective of who does make the decision, what's going to save an officer's life at the end of the day from this huge mountain of data. And that's a lot of the discussions I'm in right now of what is the definition of public safety information. It's great that I can get your blood pressure and your oxygen intake, but if I'm focused on that and missing this live streaming bank robbery in progress, what's more important? And so there's a lot of issues that we need to sort out as a community for what data means to us. Other questions? Back in the back.
You kind of covered part of that. We discussed the Internet of Things.
Yes.
Which is what you're talking about. Do you see the benefit? How much benefit do you see of that in emergency management?
So what's interesting is not all emergency managers have played around on the internet as much as I have in the past few years. And there's a lot of work that is done in the government sphere where folks are still struggling with how do I learn? How do I know what is out there in order to be able to help the environment that I'm in today? And so we're actually in this real interesting environment right now of needing to train and educate folks that have been in government service for 20 and 30 years about what they can learn about the Internet of Things. And they're already saying, swamped, busy, I don't know how to avail myself of the time to do that. And so it's a real interesting conundrum we're in to sort of, raise the awareness. And that's really what I go out and talk about a lot is usually to government audiences about the importance and things that they need to learn about social media. And so there's definitely value, but you definitely have to be able to translate the value to folks that are not technical in nature. And that's a real important thing. Question way in the back.
Yeah, it's more about people interacting socially. It's like social media has kind of dulled my skills in social interactions. I still have social skills, but a lot of people don't have a social skill. And I know that we're not going to be able to get away from our screens. But do you see like a renaissance coming back, a period where they use different social apps like Pokemon Go or Meetup or whatever feedback loop that they establish or application? Do you see that as being valuable or more, or do you see it evolving more? Or
Yeah. So I will tell you, if you can retain your communication skills, you are going to be of future value to the world for sure. And I pray for a renaissance with regards to more social interaction. But what I tell folks is even though we are becoming more digital and more reliant on digital, we also have to discipline ourselves to retain the social skills. And it's really important. I see a lot of parents that are real focused on, give my kid the technology, just let them play with it till they go to sleep at night. But you really have to sort of be intentional about, we have social engagement in this area. When we sit down to dinner and we talk. My family, my husband and I are very dedicated towards making sure that our kids call their grandparents every Sunday and have an hour-long conversation so that they know how to talk on the phone and they know how to have some very basic social skills. And I will tell you that my value in the market is huge because I can communicate. And I manage a technology group, though, that, that variety of different communication skills or different desire for communication skills, because sometimes the value of understanding the technology is also widely valuable. So when I talk about a 911 community and sort of being call takers and people that are customer service focused, I also see a future where there's digital data sifters. And those data sifters, I don't care if they have any communication skills, because what I need them to do is to stare at technology and be able to identify trends and issues and validate data for me, that as long as they can validate that data and identify threats and give us valuable information, I don't care if they go speak at a meeting, because that, different folks in the organization can do that. So there will be roles for both. I think it's more of a renaissance time perhaps for introverts because there are options, right? There will be jobs that you don't have to get out of your social bubble if you're not comfortable with that. But I will tell you that if you can retain those social skills and be able to communicate in an effective way, you will be in the leadership positions, because those leadership positions require the ability to network with your elected officials, with people in different power differentials, and people who don't understand technology. So when I say I'm a non-tech girl in a tech environment, I'm really a tech translator. I listen to my tech inputs, I go to the people who are non-tech, and I'm able to say, this is what it looks like. Let me draw it for you on a whiteboard. Let me get it real simple in crayons so that you can understand why I need money for this type of project. And so it is really important, but there needs to be a focus. It has to be intentional. You can't just, hope it will happen and then, raise kids that are not getting out of that bubble, because we have to very much kind of encourage both sides of that. Great question, though. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, this raises the question that's been in my mind here of analytics.
Yes.
And are you, your organization, or any of the 911 organizations, or even just public information, are there any particular analytical tools that you use beyond taking the phone call and writing down mark yes for and mark?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So in a 911 world, we have a computer-aided dispatch system, and it tracks everything from call response time to how fast it goes out the door. And so I am awash in statistics all day long about the 911 community. Now, on a social media perspective, I will tell you we underutilize social media analytics. I do use some of the analytics tools on Facebook, and I do use some of the analytics, kind of the Google Analytics tool set for some of the social stuff. But I'll be honest, I don't really have a lot of time to measure the impact of the message, because what I'm looking at is behavior change, right? So I'm looking at, if I tell people to go sandbag an area, do sandbaggers show up? So I don't really care if that message got retweeted 50 times. I care more about if I shared a message that said a lady has walked away from her senior center and we find her, that's the success metric for me. So it's a little bit different than folks in the marketing world who are looking at how many shares, retweets, and all that kind of stuff. So I'll say it's becoming increasingly important, but I'll say we underutilize it in the public sector sphere. And so it is something that is becoming more important, but and will be important certainly to next generation 911. But underutilized in today's area, but something I would definitely see as a field of study for sure.
Cheryl, I want to just say thank you for your talk today. It's been credible and insightful, and I've learned so much, and I know that the people here in the room have, and I want to say thank you.
You're welcome.